Welcome, everyone, to Brain, our week-long series of conversations and presentations by brain researchers at the University of Minnesota. I'm Amber, the Public Science Events Manager at the Bell Museum, and the university is a real powerhouse in the field of brain science, and we at the Bell Museum are thrilled to collaborate with researchers and showcase their work over the course of this week on Facebook Live and also later in recorded videos posted to our website. You'll be able to meet researchers across all career levels in the fields of psychology, neuroscience, and neurology, and learn more about their work and even go inside their research labs and see some of their equipment. So you may be asking, why are we so focused on brains? Well, this Thursday, October 15th, the Bell Museum is debuting an original planetarium production called Mysteries of Your Brain, where we'll be showcasing this new animated film all weekend long, and then it will be shown daily as part of our regular schedule. So before I introduce our special guest for today, I'd like to thank Boston Scientific for their generous support of our brain-related programs and activities in the museum. All right, it's time to put on our thinking caps and welcome today's guest. Dr. Manny Esguerra is a research assistant professor with the University of Minnesota's Institute for Translational Neuroscience. And after studying vision and the retina for many years, he switched his focus and is trying to understand the brain mechanisms of drug addiction. He currently works with the medical discovery team on addiction at the medical school at the University of Minnesota. Manny grew up in New York and his parents are from the Philippines, and he's been in Minnesota for 25 years and lives in Northeast Minneapolis with his family. In addition to his work in science, Manny is a youth soccer coach, which I'm sure he enjoys greatly on these beautiful days. Today, he'll be telling you all about our brains and how they work, and he even has a real brain to show us. We will have some time for questions, so if you have any, please post them in the comments on Facebook. We'll save some time at the end to ask those questions. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Esguerra. Can you show us your lab?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you to the Bell Museum and Holly for setting all this up. I am so excited to talk to all of you today about some of what a scientist does and especially what brain scientists do. I want to make clear first, I am called Dr. Esguerra, but I'm not a medical doctor, like a doctor that you'd go see when you're sick or you need a checkup. That's an MD. I have a PhD, which means that I'm allowed and expected to do research on how the brain works. I went to school for a long time to get a PhD. So I went to college, and then after college, I went to grad school. And if they still counted grades, I would have finished graduate school in grade 23. But what's really cool about being a scientist is that every day you still learn something. So getting my PhD doesn't mean at all that like I know everything about the brain. Nobody does. But that's what science is about, right? It's about doing experiments and testing and trying to figure out how things like the brain work. So like Amber said, I brought actually a couple of brains today. And I'd like to ask kids at this point, did you bring a brain too? And usually, I'll bet a bunch of you are pointing at your heads right now. Sometimes it takes a second for people to realize they brought a brain as well. While we're going through all this, I'd like you to think about what you couldn't do if you hadn't brought your brain today. One of those things is, well, you wouldn't be able to understand what I'm saying or think about it or remember things or remember your questions. And what that means kind of blows my mind is that your brain is communicating with my brain about the brains that I'm going to show today. I think this is just an awesome way to kick off Brains at the Bell this week, and I'm really appreciating this opportunity. So I am going to bring out a couple of human brains now. These are real. They're from the anatomy collection at the University of Minnesota. I want to emphasize when we have real brains and real human body parts, we treat them with a lot of respect. They were donated by real people who said, after I die, I'd like to donate parts of my body. So medical students and scientists and school kids can learn from them. So we want to have a lot of respect for those folks. We would appreciate, these brains not being turned into like memes and stuff, because it is going to be online. They are from real people. The other thing I'd like to say is there are people who might have a cultural or religious or other traditional sort of objection to being around real human body parts. So keep that in mind. And I'm going to bring out the brain now. So this is an actual human brain. This is preserved by a process called plastination that makes it like rubber or plastic, so it's pretty tough. It's nice to have these. The brains that we usually get are a little more delicate than this. So it's nice that this one doesn't have to be kept so wet. You can see here that I can hold it in my hands. One of the first things that people say when I bring out a human brain is, oh my gosh, it looks so small, right? But watch, if I do this, if I turn my head, and I actually can't see right now, but if I hold it up to the side of my head like this, do you see how it would fit? Like it would just fill my skull, right? And my wife says I actually have a pretty big head. So a brain is pretty large, just as in your head, your brain fills up your skull. It weighs, when it's alive, about 3 pounds. So 3 pounds is like the size of a small chicken, maybe, something like that. That 3 pounds of stuff inside your head does all these amazing things for you that you might be thinking about right now. There are a lot of parts to it that it turns out have really specific functions and do really specific things for you. It's not just like a lump of pudding inside your head. Neuroscientists know and are still learning some of the details about what the different parts do. And I want to point out some of those to you now. So we have things like the senses, right? Your brain, you really need your brain to take in that information from your senses, right? And make sense of it, make it into useful information for your body. One thing I say to kids sometimes when I'm in the classroom is, imagine if you could take out your eyes and keep them alive in a dish and just sitting there in a dish separated from everything else. Could you say that those two eyeballs were seeing? And they realize, well, no, it has to be connected to a brain to work, right? So the next time somebody asks you, what part of your body do you see with, you should say your eyes and your brain. Your eyes are connected to your brain by a couple of big nerves on the bottom here. Let's see if I can show them on the camera. That makes kind of this X right here, right at my fingertips. Those are called the optic nerves. They're these gigantic nerves that connect the eyes to the brain. Then the information goes through those nerves from your eyes and ends up on the back of the brain here in what's called the visual cortex. So that's a part of your brain that's really important for like seeing and interpreting that information from your eyes. We know of other senses too, right? We learned about the sense of hearing, which kind of this part of your brain takes care of. There's a sense of touch, and that's really first cared for in this sort of strip right here, down the like middle and the side of the brain. And we know about taste and smell. They're kind of processed like here, right above your eyeballs, actually, at least at first. So that's the 5 senses that we learned. It turns out there are a lot more than 5 senses. Neuroscientists, depending on who you talk to, can describe sometimes as much as like 20 senses or more. And that includes things like knowing where the parts of your body are. It's called proprioception. It's a big word. Imagine if you were to close your eyes and somebody were to pose you like an action figure or a puppet, right? So they might put your one arm up like this and one arm like that. You could try it right now. Close your eyes and just kind of put your arms in a position like one up and one down. And if you think about it, you know like where your arms are, right? And how your joints are bent. And you're not using any of those other senses because your eyes are closed, you can't see them, your arms don't make sounds, and hopefully you're not smelling or tasting them. So there's another sense. It's called proprioception. It's a sense of where the parts of your body are. Even things like hunger are sometimes classified as senses. We even talk pain is a special form of the sense of touch. So we can describe many, many senses. And one thing to remember is that your brain is taking all that stuff in all at the same time, right? When you feel, when you're touching something, like I'm touching this right now, my sense of sight and sense of hearing don't turn off, right? I'm seeing and hearing all at the same time, and maybe smelling the chemicals that were used to preserve this brain, and all those other senses are happening. So your brain is just this incredible incredible calculating mechanism. And that's just taking in information. It also has to do things for you, right? So you might have to react to something and run away or jump or kick a soccer ball. There are parts of the brain that are important for that, right? So again, on the outside of the brain here, there's a strip in front of that touching part of the brain called the motor cortex, where like the commands for making your limbs move and stuff like that are kind of finally sent out from your brain. In the back here and on the bottom, so like right in the back of your head above your neck, there's this really cool part of the brain called the cerebellum. So that's these two big lobes here on the back. The cerebellum is really important for balance and coordinated movements and things like that. There's a joke among neuroscientists that your brain has about 100 billion neurons, and 110 billion of them are here in our brain cells is neurons, and 110 billion of them in your cerebellum. It takes so much brain power to calculate things that we think are simple, that you need a huge, huge amount of brain cells back there. One of the things I'm talking about is like, well, balance when you're walking or riding a bike. This part of your brain is really important for that. But even for things like just touching your nose, we can all do that, right? It's really easy. It turns out that's an incredibly difficult computational problem to figure out, because if you think about it, your finger is at the end of a chain of like 7 joints or something, right? Because your finger can bend, your wrist can bend, your elbow, your shoulder, and that can put this fingertip anywhere on the side of your body and even on the other side. So your brain is doing the computations that it needs to get this little tiny part of your body to the tip of your nose, which you can't even see, right? So when you were learning how to do that, because you did have to learn it, your cerebellum was kind of setting up all the programming and wiring in the brain that was necessary for that. You think about a baby, right, who, tries to touch their brain and touch their nose, and they kind of mess up, right? But eventually they learn, they get better and better at it, and they can just do it really smoothly and automatically. The cerebellum's helping you learn that. One side point, the cerebellum is one of the parts of the brain that gets affected first by alcohol. So when people drink a lot of alcohol, it sort of messes up the function of the cerebellum. And that's why when people drink too much, they have trouble walking. And it used to be they tested whether people were drinking too much or were drunk by having them try to touch their nose. And they can't do it because their cerebellum got messed up. So you might ask, how do we know these things about human brains and like where like the seeing part of the brain is and cerebellum? And I didn't even talk about the front part here, the frontal cortex. Well, we can't do experiments on humans, really, right? So we figured out a lot of that stuff from basically injuries to brains and diseases. And when things went wrong, people can have strokes, which is a loss of blood supply to part of the brain. So see these red and blue lines on here? These are actually the veins in blue and the arteries in red, right, which carry blood to and from the brain. A stroke is when one of those gets blocked up. And just like any part of your body, the brain needs a lot of blood to do its thing. So if you block up one of those arteries, that part of the brain doesn't get blood and oxygen, and it can die. So those injuries can be actually pretty small. Neurologists figured out after a while, there's sort of a map of where things are. So if somebody were, say, to have a stroke right back here in the visual part of the brain, the seeing part of the brain, they realized people might lose a part of their visual field. They wouldn't be able to see a certain part of the world in front of them if they had their stroke in a certain part of their seeing part of the brain. There was a famous case in the 1900s of a gentleman named Phineas Gage. He was a railroad worker when they were building railroad tracks across the United States. And he worked with dynamite and iron spikes. And one day, so he was a really nice guy apparently, and he worked hard and he was quiet and he saved his money working on the railroad. One day he was working with his dynamite and his iron spikes. The dynamite exploded and one of these iron spikes went right through his head. It went under his eye, through his brain, and out the top of his head. And he survived this accident amazingly. So what happened was in his brain, the spike went through and kind of destroyed the front part of his brain here, what we call the frontal cortex and some other things. And what his coworkers noticed really soon after his accident was he was a totally different person. So he wasn't a nice person anymore. He became very rude. He couldn't save his money, and he lost his job. And that's one of the really closely studied indications of this front part of the brain being the part of the brain that helps us to make decisions and to make good choices and to control our emotions and things like that. It's kind of a uniquely human part of the brain. If you look at animal brains, even monkey brains, they don't have this sort of front part here for that decision making and all that kind of stuff. I mean, monkeys sort of do, but they don't have as complex of a network of decision making brain cells as we have. Rodents, dogs, they don't really have that. If you think about, if you have a dog, if you think about your dog, they might see their leash and get excited about going for a walk, but they're not really thinking ahead to, oh, I'm going to look for that squirrel I saw yesterday. I'm going to catch it this time. They really don't do that. You know, we do things like that because we have a sort of planning and executive function part of our brain in the front here. So things like injuries, bullet wounds in World War I was a way that neurologists learned a lot about what parts of the brain do. In World War I, a small caliber and high velocity, very fast bullets had been invented, and there wasn't protection against those. So a lot of soldiers in World War I got bullets go right through their brain and take out really small parts of it, and they survived that because they didn't bleed. So that was another way that neurosurgeons and neurologists started to figure out what these very specific functions were, very small parts of the brain. So if a soldier were, say, shot through an area here near the hearing part of the cortex of the surface of the brain, they might lose their ability to understand spoken language. They'd be able to talk just fine, but they wouldn't understand what somebody was saying to them. So there's this whole detailed map of what the brain does, and we're still working out, in the neuroscience department here, what different parts of the brain do and how they work together to make you do the things that you do. So one of the things that people also ask is, well, what are ways that we can understand how brains work? There's kind of two things that neuroscientists do. One thing you can do is study sort of the structure of a brain and how it's put together. What do the cells look like, and how are the different parts connected to each other, and things like that. That includes molecules and genes and sort of tracing the connections between parts of the brain. So that's one way to understand how a brain works, is just checking out the parts and how they all fit together. And there's also a way of studying the brain by looking at sort of what it does, its function. So one thing I do is I look at what single cells in a brain do. Like, the brain is made of 86 billion cells, and they pretty much all work basically the same way. The electricity that they use to communicate and chemicals, but the patterns of those kinds of electrical signals and chemical changes are what are different among different parts of the brain. And so you can look at sort of single cells and measure the electricity that they're using to do their job, and figure out, okay, the parts of the brain here use a certain kind of pattern of electricity to talk. That must mean something for the messages that they're sending to other parts of the brain. In a moment, when I give a tour of the lab, you'll see the setup that I use to study how single brain cells work. Neurologists, like I said before, can study what goes wrong with brains with diseases like stroke or epilepsy or injuries, right? And when you lose a part of the brain, you lose what it does. So they can figure out, okay, that part of the brain is for seeing motion or something like that. We also at the U of M have some of the most powerful magnets in the world at the CMMR building right next door to where I am now. Those are used for something called fMRI imaging. It's a way to look inside a living human's brain without opening their head at all, and to see what parts of the brain are active when the person is thinking about, whatever, gambling, or if they've taken drugs recently, things like that. So we can get these sort of 3D pictures of what the brain is doing by looking from the outside with powerful magnets. It's really amazing. There's still a lot to learn about the brain. We know more about the surface of Mars. We know where everything is on the surface of Mars within about, I think it's a couple of centimeters, right? Anything bigger than that, we know where it is. we know more about Mars than we know about this 3 pounds of stuff that's inside our own heads. So neuroscience needs people with a lot of different kinds of expertise and knowledge to understand this complicated thing. So even in our department, we have people who work on like molecules and atomic physics and genes and cells like I do, and behavior and even the social behavior of humans to understand what brains do. So it takes a lot of experts to do this. And I would say that almost any science could make some contribution to neuroscience. I worked for a while with an astronomer because I was getting images from my microscopes that had a lot of information in them. And astronomers are really good at figuring out like how to look at images where stuff is bright and dark and changing. So that was a lot of fun. So I would say if anybody out there is interested in science, there could be a place for you in neuroscience. I took kind of an unexpected path to this. When I went to college, I actually wanted to be a filmmaker, and I was running the filmmaking club and making movies. And at one point, my friend and I decided, hey, if we learn how people see, maybe we could make better movies, which was kind of a dumb idea. But we signed up for a course in vision in the psychology department, and I loved it. I thought it was so cool. And I got a job with that professor who taught the course, and working in his lab, and decided to do science. And I've loved it ever since. So that's why I'm here today. So I wanted to take some time, because we only have like a few minutes left, to give you a really quick tour of the lab here at the U of M. We're in a building right by the football stadium. If when there are Gopher football games, when they have the shots from the blimp of the stadium, there are some buildings right next door, and we see them every time we watch a football game. So this is one of the setups where I work. Over here, we have a microscope and a setup for looking at what single cells are doing in a piece of living brain. So we can surgically remove a little biopsy of brain, put it under the microscope here, and we can engineer the cells so they light up, so we can actually see the cells. There are some pictures over here in my computer of my computer screens of cells that are lit up in the living brain. And one thing we can do here is we can ask the brain cells electrically, what are you doing when nothing is being done to you? And then we can ask things like, okay, if we put on chemicals that act sort of like a drug of abuse, that maybe act like cocaine or something like that, then how does your behavior change, the single cell's behavior? What's really cool about what we do is we can sort of connect what's happening with single cells to the behaviors that the animal made when it got like cocaine or opioids or something like that. That is really exciting to me, and it sort of blows my mind that we can go from looking at what one brain cell is doing and say this is this one brain cell's role in addiction-like behavior in a mouse. It's amazing too, because it has implications for humans, for real people who have problems with drugs. I'm going to take you on a super quick tour of the rest of our lab area, because there's not just one lab here. There are 6 labs on this floor studying the neuroscience of drug addiction. I mean, look how big this room is. So we're down at the north end here. I'm just going to slide down here and go through and talk real quick about what people do. Because of COVID, there's not a lot of people here. Usually it's really, really busy. This is the lab of Dr. Julia Lemos, where they study like stress and how stress can affect drug addiction, especially in males and females. So she's pretty new here. There's Dr. Chris. He's also from New York. Then we have the lab of Dr. Shade Spencer, and she studies things like marijuana and what marijuana does to brains and why it feels like rewarding when people take marijuana or cannabis. We have the lab of Dr. Ben Saunders, who they study like motivation, like why do people and animals do the things that they do, and how do drugs of abuse change that? So sort of like, why does your decision-making get messed up when you take drugs? Then we have the lab of Dr. Jocelyn Richard, who studies alcohol, among other things. So how does alcohol act on those same sort of brain cells that are affected by addiction? So it's very important for understanding alcoholism. And then down here is the lab of Dr. Alec Widge. He came here from Boston very recently. He is both a psychiatrist, so he's a doctor of mental illness, but also a biomedical engineer. So they do all kinds of cool stuff where they can build like deep brain stimulators that can be implanted into humans because he is a doctor, and they can check whether putting wires inside a brain to deliver small electrical currents can change things like obsessive behavior or depression or even drug addiction. So there's all kinds of cool stuff going on here. And I love it because I like to build things. And maybe I shouldn't say this, I kind of have a short attention span, so I kind of get bored with things quickly. So it's really nice to have this huge variety of work going on in science labs. And brain science is great for that because, like I said before, there is so much yet to learn about brains that we need a lot of people working on it. In normal times, we have a conference called the Society for Neuroscience, where neuroscientists, brain scientists from around the country and around the world come together to talk about their latest results. That's 30,000 people coming to that thing. So that's how many people are working on brains and trying to understand it and how it works and what goes wrong with it, and how, hopefully, how they can help people and animals that have problems with their brains. So, Amber, that's 20 minutes. I think that's time for questions. I just want to say, I really want to thank you all for coming today because I love sharing what I do with people who aren't necessarily scientists. And I think it's a really important part of any scientist's job to do this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Esguerra. We did have some questions that came in from the audience. Some of them fall into the category of memory, but we also have some questions about like the functionality of the brain.
Sure.
One of them that came up when you were showing us the live brain was that someone noticed that there are some spots that have actually been dyed almost black, and they're wondering where that is.
Okay, I'm going to put my gloves back on here. Sorry for the squeaking. I'm going to pick up the brain again. So I think you were talking about, gloves are all sticky now. You might have been talking about this back here. There is, that's sort of a side effect of them coloring the red and the blue in the blood vessels here. There's a substance called choroid, and I think that's the choroid plexus. It's kind of a part of the circulation of the brain, and I think that's why it turned dark there. So this isn't really an indication of disease or anything. I do actually have a brain from an Alzheimer's patient that shows some of the degeneration that happens with Alzheimer's disease. Let me get that out quick. This is courtesy of Dr. Linda McClune and the anatomy program here at the U. So this is a real brain from a human that donated their brain, and they had Alzheimer's disease. That's what they died of. And can you see the difference between this brain? This is that front part of the brain I talked about that's important for making decisions and to some extent memory as well. But look at the difference between these two brains. Can you see that, a brain is kind of all folded up on the surface, right? In this one, the folds are really tight. There's a lot of brain stuff here, a lot of brain tissue. On this one, which had Alzheimer's, you can see that the brain has really shrunk. So the spaces in between the folds have gotten really, really big. So that's one of the hallmarks, one of the signs of Alzheimer's disease is that you lose a lot of brain cells and your brain like physically shrinks and the gaps get bigger. So in very advanced Alzheimer's disease, you can see that the brain actually shrinks from loss of brain cells. And we know that Alzheimer's affects primarily memory, but other functions as well. And, it's one of the mysteries of the brain and what goes wrong with it. We don't really know what causes Alzheimer's disease, so we don't know how to really cure it or treat it yet. It's a big, big area of research, including here at the U. So again, we need a lot of people working on things like Alzheimer's.
Thank you. We also had a question about electricity in the brain and how it's created and how it functions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that if you've done some work on it? So to send signals from
Well, we looked at the optic nerves before that connect the eyes to the brain. For cells to send signals along that, which is a long distance for cells, along that couple of centimeters, it turns out that brain cells have evolved. The best way to do it is to send electrical signals. Now, it doesn't work the same way as electricity in a wire, where the electrons are sort of shaking back and forth. Your brain and the cells in your body are filled with basically dissolved salts, like sodium chloride, which is table salt, and there's potassium salt and stuff like that. And the way those ions, those dissolved salts are distributed across like the inside and outside of a brain cell, it sets up like an electrical field. And it's changes in the salts moving in and out of brain cells that produces the electricity. So it's positive. If you've learned something about like dissolving ions and stuff like that, it's positive and negative charges in water just kind of moving in and out of a cell. And that's like the electricity that I measure. But it lets brain cells do two things. One, like I said, was transmit information over long distance. And the other is, it's one way that brain cells like do their computations is by adding up little electrical signals they get from other brain cells that are connected to them, and sort of doing this computation of like, okay, the balance is of the cells that are connecting to me are saying, okay, you need to become more active and fire more electricity. And so I'm going to send that signal on to the next cell, or it might not. And one of the things we're trying to do is figure out how a brain like adds up all that information, that electrical information, into signals that it finally sends out to say, okay, move your arm, or take that drug, or draw your hand away from the fire. We're still trying to figure that stuff out. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think we have time for one more question. And there were a couple that came in about just the different parts of the brain. And someone, if there's specific areas of the brain that are connected to special talents. And an additional person had mentioned and was wondering if the cerebellum is actually larger in athletes. So can you talk a little bit more about how our individual brains might be different based on what we're good at?
Yeah. One thing I didn't mention is you are pretty much born with all of the brain cells you're ever going to have. Imagine, think about a baby's head and how big a baby's head is relative to its body, right? They have heads that are way too big. And that's because they're born with these huge brains. We should know about our brain cells that for the most part, when brain cells die, they're gone forever. The flip side of that is you're pretty much born with all the brain cells you're going to have. You add a few more during life, but the way a brain adds to its function, the way you learn things isn't by adding new cells or adding new stuff. It's by making those connections I talked about before. It's by making those connections stronger between brain cells. So when you train your brain, I'm going to bring up soccer again. When you train your brain to do something like a step over in soccer, it's this, fairly complicated move when you're first learning it. Your cerebellum is forming new connections between the existing cells that are essentially sort of like a computer program, so that the next time you need to do a step over in soccer, your brain calls it up and knows how to do it. And every time you do it, it gets better and better, and those connections get sort of finer and finer. You asked about specific talents. It sort of depends what you're talking about. Some kind of talents like, playing a violin require a lot of your brain, right? You need to be listening, you need to be moving your fingers. So your hearing part of your brain, right? Your finger moving part of your brain up here would be active. You need your memory if you're playing something from memory. So a huge part of your brain is engaged when you're playing music. It's actually one of the things specifically studied with the big magnets next door over here, is people playing or listening to music and looking at what the differences are in parts of the brain that light up. On the other hand, there's apparently a really specific reading part of the brain where they're really the only species on Earth that can read a book, right? And it turns out that there's this sort of area that's near like language and seeing and even hearing parts of the brain about here that apparently evolved specially in humans for reading. That's something that's pretty new and still a little controversial, but it's a really specific sort of skill that may require like one really small part of your brain to sort of integrate all that information. But yeah, that's That's a really good question, actually. I could talk for an hour just about that and, and talents and how the brain makes new connections. Thank you for that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your research with us today, and especially being in your lab to show us some of the equipment and the things that you're working with. We do have some other questions that have come in, and I will share those with you, Dr. Esguerra, so that we can see if we can maybe answer them in a written form, because unfortunately we do have a limited amount of time today.
Yeah, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, but thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I do want to thank our audience today for joining us for our first installment in this Brain to Brain series that we're doing all week. Once again, special thanks to Boston Scientific for their support of this work and educational programs to help us learn and understand more about our brain. We will have another program this afternoon at 4 o'clock. We hope that you can join us at that time. Those researchers will be talking about adolescent brain development. And if you want to know more about the schedule, we've posted the entire schedule of live programs in the comments box on Facebook. So you can check that out and see what else there is to learn. So once again, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Manny. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed this very much.